All right, so I got a question on Twitter here that says, for beginners, there's a knowledge gap between the stripped down Sinatra and the conveniences or the conventions offered by Ruby on Rails. And so what I wanted to do was quickly go through an example where we look at a Sinatra app and talk about how that would work in Rails. So I'm going to use one of the Stripe samples. Stripe samples create, check out one-time payments. This is a really simple Stripe sample. And the reason why I wanted to use it is that it will show get requests, post requests, and webhooks. And it should help folks kind of close that gap if you're looking at a Sinatra example and want to know how things fit together. So this is the Sinatra example. Sinatra is like really slimmed down. You basically just have, in some cases or in many cases, you'll just have a single file called server.rb, and like most of the code, if not all of the code, will just live in that one file. This file is 114 lines long. And the way that it works is you define routes by calling methods, and the methods are like get, post, put, delete, etc., etc. And when you define them, you pass in the path or like the string path that it should match on. So in this case, we're saying a get request to the root route should execute this block, this Ruby block, and whatever the return value is, or if we're calling send file, like whatever the return value is of the block. So the implicit return value in Ruby is the last line that's executed. So that's the content that's going to be returned to the client that is making the request. So here we have a get request to slash, and it says return some HTML. In this case, it's finding index.html in the local directory. So that lives here in client under index.html. So it's just like reading in that file and sending that back to the client. That's what this get route is doing. And then get config is just sending back some JSON here. So this is how you would render back JSON in Sinatra. So so as we're working through this, let's actually implement this same server in a Rails application. Let's see. So this is checkout one-time payments. That's our Stripe sample. And then I'm going to say Rails new checkout translation. Checkout Rails translation. And we'll say no tests. Skip turbo links. Skip listen. Database is Postgres. In the Stripe samples, and many times when you look at Sinatra examples, they're not going to have a database, or maybe they will, maybe they won't. But in the case of Stripe samples, we don't usually have a database. But I think maybe Rails would just use SQLite if we didn't give it anything. So we are installing a brand new Rails app. All right, so we have successfully installed Rails. Okay, so the first thing that you'll notice in Rails is that it comes with way more files. Okay, so this is just a brand new vanilla Rails app, right? And it comes with all these directories and files. And so the very first thing we want to do is, like, if we just go to the very top here, require Stripe. So in Sinatra, we just require the gem at the top. You may have a gem file, which specifies the gems that you are like managing or whatever. In Rails, we're going to have a gem file also. So let's go make sure that we have Stripe installed in our gem file for Rails. So on the Rails side, I'm going to open up gem file. You'll notice it comes with a whole bunch of gems to start with, but at the very bottom, we can just add gem Stripe. And then here we also have RSpec and REST client. Oh, actually, sorry. This is the gem file that we care about. .env, Sinatra, and Stripe. And that's it. So I'm not going to install .env. So .env is a gem for managing environment variables. Rails comes with a built-in credentials or secret management thing. So we're going to use that when we work with Rails. So we only really need to install the Stripe gem. So we've done that. After you change the gem file, you have to run bundle install so that it pulls down those gems, or the libraries, and installs them for you. Okay, so now that we have bundle installed, let's keep going. So we've required Sinatra, required .env, and then we call .env.load. This .env thing, we cover .env and how we use .env in environment variables in some episodes that are over on the Stripe developers channel. So if you want to go head over there and check that out, that's how those, or that might be helpful in understanding like this gem and what this command or what this method does on .env. All right, then the next thing we're doing here is we're trying to check, we're doing like a simple environment variable check. So when we call .env.load, it should load up the environment variables that are stored in this .env file. So it's expecting that in the environment we have some price ID, and then we're also going to set the API key here. So I'm going to like just hand wave over this and say that we're going to set this environment variable. This is just a tool for checking to make sure that environment variables are set. It's specific to Stripe samples. It doesn't really matter, but I did want to show you where you might set API keys. And this is going to apply for like any third party when you're working with Rails. So back over in Rails, I'm going to go to config initializers. So these are initializers. These initializers are Ruby files, and they're basically scripts that will run at the beginning when the app is booting. They only run once, and they're gonna run when the app is starting up. So keep that in mind. But here we can say we can add a new file called stripe.rb. So here now under config initializers stripe.rb, we're just going to set stripe.api key here, and this will globally set our API key. So in Sinatra, we're globally setting it like this. In Rails, we're going to globally set it. But instead of reaching into env, when we're in Rails, we can say rails.application.credentials.dig, and then we can pass it like a list of keys that we're going to reach into the credentials file. So I'm going to say Stripe and API key. And that's going to globally set our Stripe API key. Now this rails.application.credentials thing is it's part of Rails, and where do these end up? Okay, so credentials.yaml.enc is the encrypted credentials. So right now, if you try to open that file and just like edit it directly, you'll notice that it's like this blob that you can't read or understand. That's because it's encrypted based on this master key. So the master.key allows you to encrypt credentials.yaml. Now this master.key in Rails is get ignored. So if you look at, oh gosh, that's nasty. So if we open up .getIgnore, we'll see that master.key is ignored. And this is ignored because we don't want to commit this or publish this anywhere, because this is the key that can be used to decrypt that credentials file. So we are going to commit and push that credentials file. It'll be encrypted, but we don't want to pass our master.key anywhere. Instead, we're going to manage that manually, and anywhere that we're deploying to in production, we're going to take the value for that key and set it as the value in environment variables. So Heroku config set. Yeah, so for Heroku, you run Heroku config :set, and then you set this environment variable, rails_master_key, and you just set it to that value. So like whatever the value is of your master key, you set that value, and that will allow you to decrypt those credentials. So let's see, what do we want to do? All right. We want to say Rails. Oh yeah, you might be wondering, like, how do you actually set those values then? So Rails credentials :edit is the command, and you have to tell it which editor you want to use when you're editing this. So we set this editor environment variable, and then we call Rails credentials :edit. That'll open up our credentials file and allow us to set some values. So what I like to do is we can create this top level Stripe key, and we'll say API key is our API key, and then we might say like public key is our public key, and webhook secret is our webhook secret. So these are all API keys you can find in the Stripe dashboard. And again, we're just working on this line from the Sinatra's server.rb. Right now, we're setting the value for our secret, publishable, and webhook signing secret. These are three API keys you can find in your Stripe dashboard. We have episode all about authentication with Ruby, and so you might want to go check out that episode. But by setting these values here, when we close the editor, it's going to encrypt this file. So one other thing we need in order to, we'll call that good. So I'm going to close Vim, and when I do so, it's going to re-encrypt this file. All right, so now when we run Stripe, this Stripe initializer, it's going to reach into application credentials. It'll deserialize those, and it's going to pull out the top level Stripe key, and then underneath that, it's API key. And so that should set our Stripe API key. We can check this by saying Rails C or Rails console, and this opens up the Rails console for us. And then we can just quickly check, as in, okay. So Stripe price.list or something. See if it'll actually fetch our API or prices. And it does. This means our API key is set successfully and was set during in that initializer when it was booting up Rails console, and that like loads the app for you. Okay. Set static to true. This allows us to serve. So this is back in Sinatra again. Set is a method that comes from Sinatra, and these are a bunch of config variables that you can set and configure as part of Sinatra. One of them is static true. This allows us to serve static assets. With Rails, instead of, you don't need to do that. You can just put files in this public directory. Public folder. In the sample, we specify the public folder as like one directory up and over into this client. So again, nothing, you don't have to do anything there. For port 4242, when you start a Rails app, you can specify the port. I can't remember exactly the format, but yeah, okay, so -- port 4242 should fire it up on 4242. Okay, I haven't. So when you have a brand new Rails app, you have to run rake db create, and you can like stack these. So rake db create. This will create our database locally if I have Postgres running, and I do. And then db migrate will run all of our migrations that haven't run or need to run. Okay, so I'm going to start it up again on port 4242. We refresh the page here. Come on down. Okay, yay, you're on Rails. All right, so Rails app is up, it's running, and we're off to the races. Bind, this is just binding it to this specific IP address, which is a loopback address. And I don't think we need to worry about that. Instead, it's binding to 127.0.0.1, which is fine. This 0.0.0.0 is something that we're doing to help test these in CI, so you don't have to worry about that. All right, let's go on to the next step here. So get /, when you receive a request to the root route, send this file back. And right now we're sending back some index.html, and that is this HTML content here. So I'm just going to copy that and then come back over to Rails, and in public we have, there's nothing here. So this HTML is actually just like default HTML that's coming from Rails somewhere deep inside of Rails. There's a couple ways we could do this. We could add index.html here in the public directory and just like paste in all the HTML from the other example. check out Rails. Okay. Okay. So we set up index.html. And if we go straight to /index.html, it loads. That's kind of annoying. So instead, what we want to do is we don't want to add index.html to the public directory. Instead, we generally will create a new controller just for rendering like the marketing page or like some route. And so in Rails, what you might do is say Rails G controller, Rails G controller static pages. And so this is going to generate a static pages controller. And then if you pass in any names after that, just bare words, it'll create views and routes for those. So I'm going to say Rails G controller static pages for the root route. So Rails is going to create a new controller called static pages. It's creating a whole bunch of other stuff too. We don't need this. We don't need this. And yeah, that's probably fine. Okay. So after we've created a controller, that will live in app controllers. So here now you'll notice that we have this new controller called static pages controller. And it has one method in here called root. And if we look in views, we have a static pages directory, and that has a page called root.html.erb. And so in the static pages root, this is kind of the default that comes with the view if you use this Rails G controller. So if we go to routes, so in config, so if we go to the config at the top level of the directory here, so config and then routes.rb, this is where we define all of our routes and how they relate to the controller actions. So in here, right, we want to define a root route. So when we receive a request to /, we are going to render back that the HTML for that root page. So we want to say root, and then we can just give it static pages, and then the £, and then the word root. And the way that so root is taking in a string, and the string value is the name, like the name of the controller, and then the £, separates the name of the controller with the method that we want to call. So if we restart our server here, and then change our request to go back to the root route, okay, refresh. You'll see that now we're getting back static pages root. So this is the view that we can now change. So if we wanted to, in this root.html.erb, which is in an app view, app views static pages root html.erb, we could just delete all the HTML that's there, and then we could technically copy everything that's over here and dump that in, and then refresh this page, and then we would see kind of the HTML that we're getting back from the existing index.html in the Sinatra example. The difference is that there's a little bit of wonkiness happening here, because in Rails, there's another view, there's like another part of views called layouts. So if you go to views layouts, this application.html.erb is the default layout that's used for all pages that are rendered when you're loading these controllers. So there's actually some like basic HTML, and in the body, there's this yield method, which is using embedded Ruby, right? And calling yield. And when it's generating the HTML that's going to be returned to the client, this yield is going to be replaced by whatever is in the view. So right now in the view, we already have some HTML and a bunch of stuff in the head, but we don't actually want any of that, because the only thing that, like generally all of this stuff would go in your template, in your application HTML ERB template. And then you would really only need whatever content is like generally in the body inside of your view. There's probably other things here that we would want to pull out and put up in application HTML ARB, but for now we'll just say like whatever, and we'll kind of run it like this. Okay, let's see what's next. So that's kind of how you would add this get for the slash, is you add this controller action, routes. You add a controller action, or I'm sorry, you add a route that uses this special root method, and the root method takes in a string, and the string is of this form, and that allows you to return content for the root route. Let's move on to the next one. So slash config. In this case, you might call this like configs controller or something, right? So Rails G controller. We need a controller because we need a controller action that is mapped directly to this slash config route that's being that's receiving a request. So we'll say Rails G controller configs, and there are some conventions that Rails follows, so you always want to have a pluralized controller. So it's kind of weird. You might want to call the controller config controller, but you want to, just pluralize it, and it'll help you. So what we can do now is go back to our roots, and now we want to add a get route that goes to configs / show. Okay, so in the configs controller, we can make a show method, and the show method is going to return, what is it going to return? It's going to return this stuff. So I'm just going to copy this whole thing. So over here, this is what it is in Sinatra. And then instead, we're going to say, this is get to slash config goes to configs show. And in the show method, we don't need to specify the content type as application JSON. We do need to retrieve a price. So we can say price is equal to stripe price.retrieve, and then pass in a price ID. And then now this is where we're going to render back the JSON. So in Sinatra, the return value of the block, so this do end block, the return value of the block is what's returned to the client. In Rails, we have to call the either render or redirect. We can only do it once per controller action. And if some cases you might want to either render or redirect depending on the logic that's based in the controller. In this case, we want to render JSON. So we can say render and then pass it this hash where the first key is JSON and the value is some dictionary. And in this dictionary, I'm actually just gonna copy this and okay. So the unit amount is going to be price.unitAmount, and the currency is going to be price.currency. And then we want our public key. So here we can say rails.credentials or rails.application credentials.dig stripe public key. All right, so this should render back the JSON for this dictionary. All right, so let's make a curl request to localhost 4242/config, and that should make a get request, and it did, and we got back this data here. So that's working as expected, and that's how you define that's one of the ways you can define a route. So like technically, you could say there's a couple other helper methods in Rails. So you can say resources, configs, and this will actually create like configs / this is like gives you like this calls like the index method on the configs controller, or configs /1, and this generally calls the show method on controller, or /config /new. This is going to call the new action /config /1 /edit. and so on and so forth, right? And this actually, when you use the resources helper, that will create 7 routes for you, and it's just going to create all of them. So you could also specify that you only want like some. I only want the index, or I only want show, or I want show and new. Okay. You could also do except, and that will do certain ones. The one reason why you might want to use resources is that it follows a convention. It's super conventional. It's really easy if you're an experienced Rails dev to jump in to an application where it's following all of these conventions and using resources everywhere. So that's helpful and something to keep in mind. Something that's a little bit lesser known, actually I'm just going to leave this up. Yeah, no, whatever. Is that you can say resource config, and I believe that should map to the same configs controller, but it won't have an index action, and it won't have a so this won't have an index action which returns the list, and it won't have what are the other ones? I can't remember. But so this is good. So let's keep going. What else do we have? What else do we have here? We have get checkout session. So in Sinatra, or in this sample, we call it checkout dash session. And generally by convention, we would have the post method create the checkout session and the get method retrieve the checkout session. So let's do that like the Rails way. So I'm going to say Rails G controller checkout sessions controller, and we want, yeah, so we'll create it without any views to start. Go to routes, and we're going to say resources checkout sessions, and this is going to map to checkout sessions controller, and we want a show method which is going to return it, and we want a create method. So create, this is a controller action that maps to receiving a post request to like slash checkout underscore sessions. So post to checkout sessions, which is the same actually, yeah, let's just copy this. Okay, and then I'm going to put it in a comment too. So this is what came from Sinatra. Okay. All right. My computer is telling me that the disk space is almost full. So instead of create dash checkout dash session, we're just going to receive to like checkout session. All right. So in Rails, you when you're receiving a post request, you don't need to specify the content type. That's fine. The data that you receive is going to be available rather than saying like JSON.parse here. So in Sinatra, you have to like manually parse the request body. In Rails, you do not need to manually parse the request body. Instead, all of the data is available in params. So the request body that's being sent to us can be accessed through this params method that's on the controller action. So we don't actually need this. So here we can say like use params instead. So here we're going to say like data is equal to params or something, right? Or down, yeah, let's do that. All right, so creating the checkout session, this is all actually the same. The domain here, this is an environment variable for the sample, but we can just set it to localhost 4242/ whatever. That's fine. All right, payment method types, all of this stuff is the same. Data quantity, so you can technically in Rails, you can access this either with strings or values. I think the params, the type of this params object is called hash with indifferent access, meaning you can either use string values or you can use symbols to access the keys. So I'm just passing that in like that. And then the price here is going to be the ID of our price again. That we passed in. You can use that same credentials thing that we talked about earlier to store that if you want. It turns out that session is also a keyword in Rails. This is where how you can manage like cookies, or you can tag someone with you can use the session to manage state between the client and the server. So I'm going to call this checkout session instead of session. And again here, instead of calling .toJSON and just returning this, we want to say render JSON and then have that be the result that's returned to us. So now let's just test this out. So if I send a post request to /checkout_sessions, and the post request -d, and I think what did it expect from params quantity? So we're going to pass it, quantity is 3. Okay, we got an error. All right, what's going on here? Hard to read the error. We got some error. Let's look in the server log. Okay, in the server log, we see invalid authenticity token. Okay, so one thing that happens for you by default with Rails is that it has CSRF protection. And so right now, this controller is checking for this special CSRF token to be in the headers. I'm gonna disable that for now. You should just keep it because it's valuable. And you need to pass it from the front end to the back end, and we'll show how to do this in other examples. But for now, skip before action verify. Wait, skip. Yeah, verify authenticity token. We'll rerun the same thing. Nope. And exception was caught. What do we got now? Missing required params, line items, quantity. Data, quantity. Data is params. I'm just going to pass params quantity there. Did I spell it wrong? Quantity. Oh, I wonder if... No, yeah, that should be fine. Missing required params quantity. All right, what's going on here? Oh, okay. So in my request, I didn't pass the header telling it that it is content type application JSON. So I don't think it's deserializing it. Yeah, okay. So now we got back our session ID. This is exactly what we expect. So this is totally working now. So now we have, so we've translated this big blob from Sinatra for creating a checkout session to this new create thing. And I think data equals params. This should still work now. Cool, totally works. And we're off to the races. All right, let's update this show action. So we are going to retrieve the checkout session is equal to stripe checkout session.retrieve params ID. So for Rails, params ID, like when we hit the show action here, it's going to come to checkout sessions / and then like some ID value. And this is variable. You can set this to whatever you want, and that'll be available in params ID. And so what we're going to do here is I'm going to take the ID of the checkout session, the Stripe checkout session that we just created. So this long CS_test blah, blah, blah. And we'll pass that as our ID and use that to look up and retrieve the checkout session and then render it as JSON. So render JSON of checkout session. We'll just render that back. And that should be all that we need in order to retrieve the checkout session. So I can say, now if I say copy that, checkout sessions slash, and then post or paste in the ID, then we retrieve and pull back the entire checkout session. So that's kind of how you might translate that. Note that we're not supporting this session ID thing. It's just a different shape of a name, but this is kind of like the Rails way to do it, so I'm doing it this way. All right, the last one here is for a webhook. So we want to receive a post request to /webhook. So it would create, because this has nothing to do with checkout sessions, we're not like creating a checkout session or retrieving a checkout session. We're going to receive a webhook request, which is a post request from Stripe. So here I'm going to say Rails G controller webhooks, and we can follow, or we can use that same trick for routes that we did for resource, where it's singular. So we can say resource webhook, or we could say post to /webhook goes to webhooks / #create. So I'm just going to say resource webhook, and then we're going to go to our terminal here and say Stripe listen -- forward. Here, let's see. Stripe listen forward to localhost 4242 /webhook. This will set up a direct connection between my Stripe account and my local machine. And let's go to the webhooks controller and add a method in here for create, def create. This is where we're going to receive post requests, and then we can just copy this entire thing and come back over here. Let's say from Sinatra all right, scooch you in, comment you out. Okay, so what do we want to do? We're translating this from Sinatra to Rails. Okay. So the webhook signing secret is no longer in the env. Now it's in rails.application.credentials.dig Stripe webhook secret. We no longer need to do request.body.read. Instead, we can just construct the event. Actually, yeah, no. Okay, so for webhooks, we actually do want to do request.body.read. This is a special case that we don't want to use params because we want to pass in the raw payload as raw as possible. And then in Sinatra, it has this like status 400 thing that you can do. Instead, what you might want to do is say render JSON, give it some JSON, and then say status like bad request or just status 400. That way you can pass a message back that says like failed to parse webhook event or something. And then you can delete status. You do want to return early because you can only call render or redirect once. So I'm just going to copy that and use that in both spots. Otherwise, we're just going to parse the payload, symbolize the names, construct from. Okay, so all of that ends up being the same. And then instead of just returning status success here, we want to say render JSON of that back, and we don't need the content type anymore. Okay, so let's open a new tab and say Stripe trigger checkout.session.completed. Oops. And that will create the checkout session, pay for something, and check out. Okay, so we're getting 422 because we need to disable verification of authenticity tokens. And this you do want to do in production. You can safely disable CSRF checking for webhook endpoint because the only valid way that this should be accessed is from Stripe. So Stripe is going to send post requests to your webhooks control. This is a really common thing that you'll need for most third parties. Like anytime you're receiving a webhook notification, you want to disable CSRF. Did we stop our server? Yes. Okay, we don't have a server. All right, so nope. Rails. Okay, restarting the server. And now that that is up and running, make sure our listener is working, and then trigger our command again. And hey, look at that, 200, great. Okay, and then because we got a checkout session completed event, we do ding in the console and we have this payment succeeded thing come out. There's probably a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in Sinatra that I'm not remembering, but hopefully that covers everything that you would need to know to translate from at least from a Stripe sample that's done in Sinatra to a Rails application. So that was the intention for this episode, was to teach you how to convert from a Sinatra example and use those code snippets in your Rails app. So, all right. If you found this content useful, I appreciate that. And I would also appreciate subscribe. It definitely helps other folks find the channel and lends some credibility. All right. See you later.